to Seminars at Steamboat. I'm Joella West, Seminars Chair. If you were with us last Monday, you were part of our virtual debut. If you have any comments about how this migration is going so far, please reach out to us by going to our website, seminarsatsteamboat.org, and clicking on the contact page. If this is your first time checking us out, we're glad you discovered us, and we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Our goal is to give you an experience that will be as close as possible to the in-person events that our audiences have loved since we began at Steamboat in 2003. To everyone who has made a donation, thank you. Your contributions make it possible for us to continue presenting our talks free to the public, which is an integral part of our mission. We're very aware that during this difficult time you have many urgent causes worthy of your support, and we're honored that you have included us. If you decide that you would like to make a contribution at any time during this talk, you can do so very easily by clicking on the light green bar at the bottom of your screen. Special thanks to tonight's sponsors, Karen and Joel Piasek, and supporting sponsor, Judy Odom. If you would like to watch this talk again later or view Amy Walter's talk from last week, you can do so online by going to Crowdcast Seminars at Steamboat. KUNC Community Radio of Northern Colorado will also have this season's talks available on their website at kunc.org/seminars. You can find our events from past seasons on seminarsatsteamboat.org. As you listen today, you can submit any queries for the speaker by clicking on Ask a Question at the bottom of your screen. Our speaker today is Amna Nawaz, and here to introduce her is former board chair, Kate Hawk.
Welcome, everyone. We're so pleased to have you with us for today's Seminars at Steamboat event. Virtual this time due to the pandemic, and we apologize for the tech problems in getting it all started. But this will be no less timely or compelling than our usual sessions in the Pavilion in Steamboat Springs. If you watch the PBS NewsHour, you are already familiar with our speaker, Amna Nawaz. She's currently the NewsHour's senior national correspondent and primary substitute anchor. You may also recognize her from her former work at ABC or NBC or Nightline or The Today Show, or as a moderator of the December 2019 Democratic candidates debate. She has a broad portfolio covering politics, foreign affairs, education, climate change, culture, and sports. She has won Emmy and Peabody Awards, an award from the Society for Features Journalism, and the International Reporting Fellowship in 2009. She has made history as the first Asian American and the first Muslim American to moderate a presidential debate. She herself was born in Virginia to parents from Pakistan. She is intrepid. She began her career reporting from some of the most dangerous places in the world, Afghanistan and Pakistan's Waziristan province. She's not reluctant to tackle difficult and divisive topics. She is comfortable with the uncomfortable. In fact, she founded ABC's podcast called Uncomfortable to tackle some of the tough issues of the day. Today's topic, immigration, is one of those subjects. Few have aroused stronger feelings, especially in recent years. Amna has reported from multiple border towns in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Mexico, covering topics such as DACA, detention, refugees, asylum, and children in U.S. custody. We are so pleased to have her here to give us her signature thoughtful and thorough analysis of the issues dividing America today. She is allowing time to answer questions, so please type yours into the question box at any time during her presentation. Amna, the microphone is all yours.
Thank you so very much for that incredibly warm welcome, Kate. And thank you to all of you who are out there joining us today. I have to start by saying how incredibly bittersweet this is for me. I love to talk about this topic. As soon as I'd heard and got to know became familiar with all the content and the conversations that Steamboat curates, I was so excited to have an excuse to come out there and actually meet everyone and deliver these comments in person. And then, of course, the world changed earlier this year. So I'm very excited to be able to be with you virtually tonight. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions as well. And hopefully I will find another excuse down the line to bring my family out there. But immigration, as Kate mentioned, is an incredibly divisive topic. It's one I found over my years of covering it that a lot of people arrive at it with their minds sort of already made up. And I think it's because we hear about it so much and we talk about it so much that sometimes we feel that we know all there is to know and have our minds made up. I will say after years of covering it, both in other countries and here in the United States, I am still very much learning. So I'm very excited to share with you all that I have learned about how this administration has dramatically changed the immigration landscape in a very short 3.5 years, and to talk about how that's changed even more dramatically during the pandemic, and then how that may all bleed over into the election, whether or not it will have an impact in the general election in November. So an advance thank you to Ken, I should say, behind the scenes, who's going to be working the slides for me here. So Ken, if we can go to the first slide, that would be great. So I'd like to kind of break down, oh, we went ahead too, if we can just go back one, please. I'm going to break down my remarks sort of into 3 buckets, which will help us better understand where we are today. You cannot talk about the changes that were made to the immigration system during the pandemic without first understanding a lot of the pre-COVID policies. And when I say that, I mean all the many policy shifts and changes the administration put into place in the last 3.5 years, and there are a lot. I'm going to focus in on some of the most important ones. But once we've talked through those, then I'd like to talk about how many of those changes and shifts were accelerated during the pandemic and the cumulative effect of those previous policy changes to what happened during the pandemic and continues to happen today. And then finally, of course, I'd like to talk about how voters are perceiving all of this, how some of this is becoming part of our national discourse in a way that immigration really hasn't traditionally been. It is not traditionally a strong voting topic historically and consistently for Americans. Recently, it has become so, and certainly in the previous election and in this election, it may very well be. So, of course, we'll talk about whether or not it becomes an animating force for the president's supporters in particular. So let's go to the next slide, please. When we talk about the pre-COVID policies, you again have to break it down between illegal immigration and legal immigration. It's important too because so much of our political rhetoric focuses on the illegal actions. That is, people who are entering the United States without authorization between ports of entry or overstaying visas and then remaining illegally without authorization in the state. So I'm going to begin my comments there. And here, I want to talk a little bit about some of the campaign promises that then candidate Trump made, which defined a huge part, not just of his campaign, but also what came to be known by one administration official who later described it as sort of a white hot focus in the administration on this one issue. It was a signature campaign issue. It became a signature administration issue as well. And then there were 2 issue buckets, sort of 2 policy buckets within that, that caught most of the president's attention and where many of the policy changes have been focused. One is border crossings, and the other is the border wall. I'm going to focus a little bit breaking down on each of those as well, because again, it's one of those things we hear about a lot, we talk about a lot, we think we understand it very well, but I want to take you through some of the nuance. You'll find I'm a little bit of a data geek when it comes to these things, so I'll walk you through all of that. Let's move on. So when it comes to campaign promises, I know 2016 can feel like a very, very long time ago, but I want to play for you one video, which is a short ad that came from the Trump campaign back in August of 2016. Just let's take a listen to this.
The system stays rigged against Americans. Syrian refugees flood in. Illegal immigrants convicted of committing crimes get to stay, collecting Social Security benefits, skipping the line. Our border open, it's more of the same, but worse. Donald Trump's America is secure. Terrorists and dangerous criminals kept out. The border secure. our families safe. Change that makes America safe again. Donald Trump for president. I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
So this was, again, August of 2016, if you can think back to this time. And this was also, by the way, the very first general election ad from the Trump campaign that year. So when you look back to a campaign that's deciding where its priorities are going to be, what kind of messaging it's going to be putting out to the general electorate ahead of the election, this is where the campaign leaned in early. Immigration linked to national security. It was a messaging to his supporters that this was going to be, they could rest assured this would be a top priority for his administration, and that then continued throughout the campaign and into the administration. So those issue buckets I mentioned, if we can go to the next slide, please, Ken. Border crossings is something you probably heard about a lot. It was something the president has talked about a lot. It is something that's become something of sort of a metric for how this presidency and how this administration is doing when it comes to stifling and stemming the flow of people crossing at the southern border. So this is the detail I was talking about with the data. Ken, if we take this full screen, I want to point out a couple of really interesting data points on this thing. So this is the kind of thing that someone like me spends a lot of time breaking down. This is the chart of Southwest border crossings from the Department of Homeland Security. And what they do is chart fiscal year by fiscal year, month by month, the number of people that they call apprehensions at the southern border, which is to say they didn't come through a port of entry, they were apprehended by Border Patrol and processed in the United States before their path forward is determined. And one of the interesting things to note, which is a little hard to read, but you see a lot of those lines kind of clumped together down at the bottom. That's generally how border crossings go. They seasonally go up and down as there's instability or insecurity in some of the origin countries. They tend to go up and down a little bit. And that's the way it had largely been. What you're seeing there is 2015, 16, 17, and 18. Those are all kind of clustered down there at the bottom a little bit. When President Trump took office, monthly border crossings in January of 2017 were about 40,000. Which is not the lowest they've been in modern history, but it's also not the highest they've been in previous surges and previous administrations. What you'll see and what stands out is that orange line that starts to really creep up in January of 2019 and then steadily ticks up over time. And what was happening there was a number of animating forces, both in countries of origin that were forcing people to flee en masse, but there was also a ramp up from this administration trying to address what they saw as a threat to their promise to keep down crossings at the southern border, and none of them were really working. And so I should point out to you there, in 2019, as that orange line starts to kind of rise, the Trump administration began to implement some of the more aggressive tactics at the border. There was something called metering, which is to say, at legal ports of entry, Border Patrol officials were told to limit the number of people that they would allow in each day to a certain number, sometimes 0 in a day, just to what they said, control the capacity as it was in the internal US system. There was a surge of military forces, which you'll remember, National Guard troops called to the US border to help with administrative tasks inside some of the detention centers, which were becoming more and more full and overwhelmed with the number of people coming in. And there was also push for additional money for the border wall. This was a time of incredible heightened rhetoric, you'll remember, coming from the president as well. And then right sort of in the middle of that peak is when I made one of my trips to the border. If we can go to the next slide, please, Ken. This is another video I want to play for you. And this is from a visit I took to what's called the Yuma sector, which is in Arizona. It is about 126 miles of border that they protect there. It's one of the smaller zones, 126 miles worth of border, but it's also long been considered the gold standard at the border because they had some of the lowest apprehension rates, some of the highest processing rates, and they also had what was the most barriered sector, which is to say almost every inch of that sector every inch of that border they're meant to protect has some kind of barrier, either a man-made construction, a wall, a vehicle barrier, or a natural barrier of some kind that makes it difficult for people to cross. And at that time, those numbers were ticking up. This sector was seeing the same surge everyone else was seeing. So I chose that time to go get down on the ground and spend some time embedded with the Border Patrol units. Here's just a short clip now from that report.
Enforcement zone. So this is triple layer fencing here.
Yuma Sector Chief Anthony Probaznik says he's asked for more agents. He already has funding from last year to update 25 miles of border fencing.
This will all be replaced.
Into what?
It will be a 30-feet Ballard style fence.
His resources, he says, haven't changed since 2012, but the job has. Probaznik estimates 35 to 40% of his current manpower goes to processing and caring for the families and children in custody.
We just had a lady last week who delivered twins 2 months premature. And they see this. They see sick kids in our custody. And last year alone, we took 550 kids to the hospital, over 1,700 total here just in the Yuma area. That's a huge strain on our resources because they're doing things that are not enforcement related.
But agents concede no barrier is 100% effective. They point us towards these surveillance videos showing families climbing over sections of wall. The 14-year-old girl in this clip broke her vertebrae from the fall. Injuries, they say, are common and further stretch their resources. How far back does this date?
This dates back to about 1990.
Chief Probaznik believes updating the older wall will dissuade people from trying to cross illegally. When you see people who are willing to dig under this and climb over barbed wire and build makeshift ladders to climb over additional fencing, do you think that that's enough to deter people to try to breach it in some way?
The majority of the population, yes.
Yeah.
It will deter the majority. And what we're trying to do is impede and deny entry into this area. And so 87% of the people that we apprehend right now are family units and unaccompanied Indian children. They won't go over a 30-foot valley. Is it going to push it somewhere else? Likely, yes.
Most fascinating things from my visits to the border around this time was I found that the Border Patrol units themselves, who had faced, similar surges in the past, previously there had been some under the Obama administration as well, have really been asking for the kind of support that they haven't gotten before and still weren't getting today. The same kind of cement structures in which they were processing people were the ones they've had since 2010 and earlier. The border wall updates continue to happen, but they all acknowledge it's not enough. They need additional surveillance, they need additional staffing, they need a lot of other technology that they haven't been given. What was interesting about the way the Trump administration responded to this, though, was to really double down on the physical limitation of people, that if they could keep down the metric of border crossings, that to them became a measure of success. And as we saw, as the numbers continued to go up and up and up, because attempting to stop people right at the physical border wasn't solving the problem of why they were leaving in the first place, it became an issue of chaos. And one of those sort of turmoil-inducing points within the administration, you'll remember President Trump actually cycled through 4 different Homeland Security secretaries in 3 years, largely because this metric could not be addressed. So that is sort of the action as it came pre-COVID when it came to illegal immigration. But if we go to the next slide, this is a topic that doesn't often get as much attention, which is the many, many changes made to the legal immigration system. They don't get a lot of attention often because they're not the kind of big visual things that we can see. It's not a big border wall. It's not crowds of people being apprehended by Border Patrol. It's changes to the legal system. It's things done in conjunction with the Department of Justice, which make asylum harder to get. But these changes in many ways can have much more of a long-lasting impact and won't be easily undone by future presidents or even by lawmakers. These are not short-term enforcement actions. These are changes to the way that we process people in terms of who we allow, who we prioritize, and who is allowed to stay in the United States. The 3 kind of topics I'll talk about here in terms of the changes that were made are family unification, which has long been the largest single driver of immigration to the United States, asylum and refugees, or asylum seekers and refugees, which is, as we know, a legal form of protection that is allowed here in the United States, and a public charge rule, which I'm willing to bet a lot of you have heard about because it got a lot of attention when the Trump administration rolled it out last year and then finalized it earlier this year, not just because of what it meant and the impact it would have, but because of what it said about who we are as a country. And that was a source of a lot of debate, which we'll talk about in a moment. So if we go on to the next slide, please. When we talk about family unification, and here's where a full screen of this slide might be useful, this is what a lot of people don't often know about immigration in the United States, which is for about 1 million people who emigrate into the United States legally every year, and that number has largely held constant in modern history. The vast majority of those people are coming sponsored by other family members. It's about 750,000. I think the most recent numbers show from about 2017 or 2018. The other forms of legal entry, diversity visas, people coming on refugee status, people coming on employment visas, are really insignificant statistically. Those are the other smaller pieces of the pie you're seeing there. That one huge chunk, those are all family-sponsored immigrants coming into the United States, which really, since the big immigration law change back in 1965, has been the primary driver of immigration to the US. Basically, if you live abroad, if you have a spouse or a child or a sibling or a parent who's a US citizen, you can get sponsored to get a green card. So the plans from the Trump administration to change this were long proposed to try to limit that number, try to cut down on the number of people who are arriving on family-sponsored visas. There were a number of steps that the administration took to try to push that forward. And it was a huge part of a congressional plan, which Republicans did try to get backing for, but failed. And so they weren't able to push through some of the legal changes they would need to make to be able to change those numbers and to change those metrics. And so the president turned to other means, including trying to dismantle the diversity visa program and really trying to switch the rhetoric more to moving towards a merit-based system, which you've probably heard as well. How did he do that? Let me show you. If we go to the next slide, some of those other slices of the pie that the president and the administration could unilaterally act to change include changing the rules around asylum and refugee status. One of the biggest things that the administration did was dramatically cut the number of refugee admissions every year. There is a cap set by each administration as to how many will be allowed in each year. The cap went from 30,000 a year in 2019, which was already a reduction from the year prior, to 18,000 this year. That 18,000 caught a lot of people's attention because it is actually the lowest cap that has ever been set in the United States since Congress first created a refugee program many, many years ago. On the asylum front, basically the cumulative effect, you've heard the phrase death by 1,000 cuts, the cumulative effect here was to chip away at the many avenues that people have for this legal form of protection. It was done in conjunction with the Department of Justice and also by immigration courts setting a precedent that could be followed by later decisions made in immigration courts. So they took away domestic violence being allowed as a legal means, a legal claim for seeking asylum here in the United States. They raised the standard for what's known as credible fear. So if you arrive here as an asylum seeker and you say, I have a fear for my life, back in my home country, you're interviewed about it, the standard was raised a little bit for how imminent is the threat to you back home for you to legally get asylum. And the thing that you hear again and again from immigration judges I've spoken to through the immigration court proceedings that I've sat through is that immigration court, where all of these decisions are often adjudicated, is, as the judges like to say, kind of like dealing with death sentences in a traffic court setting. People are sped through. And the speeding up of the process, along with the chipping away of the avenues and the tightening of the rules, meant that more and more people were cycled through faster, often without their own form of representation. And what's important to remember there is it's an adversarial proceeding. Anyone who is presenting to try to argue for asylum status is arguing against the government in that case. And we have had an increasing number of people who show up in court, do not have the time to get a lawyer, are not resourced to get a lawyer because of changes made by the administration. And that includes children who are often representing themselves in these court proceedings as young as 2 and 3 and 4 years old. So that sort of dramatically undermined this one legal path for migration to the United States. And the end result was that this form of legal protection is actually harder to get now in the United States than ever before. On the next slide, we'll explore this one rule, which also had a potentially devastating effect across all of legal immigration here. And this was the public charge rule. Now, this was introduced in August of 2019. And to be clear, there's always been some kind of public charge rule that's taken into account for anyone applying for admission to the United States. Your wealth, your education, your income, all of those things are taken into account. This rule made much more stricter standards for all of those things. And basically, it says that anyone, any immigrant can be denied a green card if it's deemed that they're likely to use any kind of government benefit program, whether that be Medicaid or food stamps or housing in some form. This was finalized earlier this year, just in February of 2020, was one of sort of the last pre-COVID-ish rule changes. But the justification from the Department of Homeland Security was that this goes to the core of who we are. As you can see, when they published the rule, they said, self-sufficiency has long been a basic principle of U.S. immigration law since our nation's earliest immigration statutes. And so this was another unilateral step the administration could take that immigration advocates argued would not only impact who's allowed in, because certainly if you're taking into account income, there are parts of the world in which the income is just dramatically lower than it is in Western parts of the world. Latin America, for example, Africa, for example, parts of Asia, for example. But it would also have an impact on that family unification part we talked about earlier. Because if this is enough to exclude someone from entry to the United States, it doesn't matter if you have a US citizen relative already here willing to sponsor you. So let's move on to the next slide then. What happened during the pandemic when the world changed? Well, our immigration system changed as well too. What we found was that a lot of the steps that had been either too draconian or too difficult to implement or even too difficult to defend in court as ways to limit immigration to the United States previous to the pandemic were suddenly allowed during the pandemic because the administration could say these are steps that are necessary for us to take under our emergency powers in response to a global health crisis. So you saw one of the first steps really goes back to how they addressed illegal immigration earlier. In March of 2020, one of the earliest steps they took related to immigration was to essentially shut down the borders for both the northern and the southern border. And when I say shut down, I mean they issued a rule saying all non-essential travel should now be limited. So trade, economics, those continue to move back and forth across the border to some degree, but anyone, even someone who legally walks across the port of entry threshold from Mexico into the United States holding a sign that says, I am fearful for my life, I wish to seek asylum here, that person is not allowed into the United States because of these rules right now. So it is essentially basically shut down that legal path for anyone at the southern border. And that has been extended every 30 days since the end of March, since the rule went into place. Another thing that the administration did was to suspend all routine visa services overseas. So if you are someone who is mid-process applying for a visa or coming on a family-sponsored visa to the United States or working on an employment visa, all of those processes were stopped in their tracks. It had a devastating effect for hundreds of thousands of people and has really put them into limbo, but was one of the steps that they said was necessary to take to contain the spread of the coronavirus. They also stopped in-person services here in the United States, which led a lot of people who were mid-process here in reaching their citizenship status in limbo as well, unsure if they're going to be able to move forward with the process. They put a pause on employment visas. This was something you may have heard about recently, which the president took unilateral action to do in issuing an executive order that basically suspended work visas through the end of the year, the calendar year at least. This had an effect on hundreds of thousands of foreign workers seeking employment here. That includes health workers and doctors and nurses and engineers and IT specialists. And part of the justification was health. Part of it was to say we want to limit the number of people coming up during a global pandemic, but part of it was also economic. You heard the administration make the argument that because of the resulting economic fallout from the pandemic, we need to make sure that Americans are first in line for these jobs when they begin to open up, So we're going to limit the number of people coming from foreign countries eligible for those positions. And that ban remains in place. The last thing to note is during the pandemic, the administration has continued with deportation proceedings and deportation flights and detention of people that ICE, our Interior Enforcement Agency, has been carrying out. And there's a whole nother presentation I can do another time about the many issues surrounding that, because many people are concerned about continuing to round people up en masse and hold them in close detention facilities for nonviolent crimes and continuing to send them to their home countries on flights when they all haven't been tested for the coronavirus. What is the health impact of that? But those enforcement actions have continued at this time as well. So what does all that mean? If we go to the next slide, the big question really is, do people care? Does the average American citizen care that the administration has taken this approach to immigration, has this aggressive hardline stance? Is immigration a voting issue? And when you look into it, it has been in the past, in the recent past. In 2018, largely around much of the president's hardline rhetoric, Democrats were animated to show out and show up in record numbers in some cases, and that led to many of those Democratic gains in the midterm elections of 2018. What we don't know is what kind of impact it will have ahead, but when you break it down, you have to look at a few different issues. One is the partisan divide, which has always persisted in modern history, and you won't be surprised to learn persists today. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. But the other is a recent look at some battleground polls. When you ask people you consider to be in the middle, independents, up for grabs, in battleground states like Arizona and Florida and Michigan and Wisconsin, is immigration an animating force? Do you care about immigration as a policy? You won't be surprised to learn that more recently, the economy is increasingly the top issue for Americans, and immigration has moved way farther down the line. So maybe it doesn't matter to the people who are still waiting to make up their minds and can make the difference in many of these elections in the key states. The pandemic effect, of course, cannot be overstated. Everything has changed. People's, the way they factor their votes, the way they weigh their issues has changed. And immigration is not necessarily one of the top issues, but a lot of immigration adjacent issues are. So if you think about the economy and you think about jobs, you have to think about essential workers, and many of those essential workers on the front lines are immigrants. You know, when you think about the future employment after the pandemic and in an economic recovery, there's a lot of people who worry that, as has happened in the past in the US, native-born populations and economic contractions tend to turn on immigrant populations. So that, again, could be an animating force one way or the other. More data on my next slide, because again, I gave you fair warning. I like to dig into the numbers. Here are the most recent numbers. When you really try to figure out, do people care? Is immigration a big enough issue that it's going to have some kind of impact on the election? These are numbers from the Pew Research Center. These are very recent, just from last month, mid-June. And it's asking people who self-identify as either Republicans or Democrats what they consider to be very big problems. In other words, what are the big things that you think need addressing in the following months and in the election ahead? And what you'll see, if you can even read this, I apologize, but all the way down at the bottom of that list is illegal immigration. Unsurprisingly, things like racial justice are now closer to the top. Climate change continues to be. The response to the pandemic, healthcare, unemployment, even ethics in government is ranking much higher than it sometimes can. And down the list, when you come to illegal immigration, only about 28% of people polled think that it is a very big problem that needs addressing, but there is that partisan divide that I mentioned before, which still persists. Among those 28%, you see about 43% of those are self-identified Republicans. 15% of self-identified Republicans do not think it is a very big deal. And so the big question, does this all matter? Well, if we go to the next slide, I think the question is really, does the president think it matters? And the answer there is very much yes. What you're looking at, and if you're asking yourself the question, are we going to be talking about immigration? Is it a very big issue? I think if the president Hi, can you still hear me?
We can, Amna. You're all good. You're back online.
I should disclose, as I work from home, as we all are right now, I am broadcasting from my basement, and a wicked thunderstorm just started rolling overhead in the last 10 minutes or so. So I apologize. I lost connection there. I'm not sure where exactly I cut out, if it was on this slide. It was perfect timing, because this was my very last slide, which was basically to make the point that even though the rest of the American voting public may not be sure whether immigration is an animating force, whether it is enough of the voting issue for them,
One who got the thunderstorms.
certainly does. So with that, if we have time and as long as I have a connection, I would love to take some of your questions.
Yes, we do have a little time. I hope the audience will stay with us a little bit of extra time since we've lost a bit of it. It's always the tech things that give heart attacks to presenters and tech people in the background as well. So glad you're back. Thank you. It was a most enlightening presentation and put a great many things into context. We appreciate that very much. We do have questions. I'd like to begin with this one for you. In Ronald Reagan's final speech as president, he said, and I quote, "We lead the world because, unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength, from every country and every corner of the world. This, I believe, is one of the most important sources of America's greatness." Why do you think so many people seem to have lost sight of that?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I think in the conversation today around immigration, it may seem as if a lot of people have lost sight of that. But in fact, if you look through history, we go through periods like this. And occasionally, from the very first arrival of people on these shores all the way up to last month, there are periods of time in which both socially and then politically and legislatively, we have worked to discriminate against more recently arrived people. You think back to, in the 1920s even, there was a move to physically, actually legally limit the number of people coming from certain countries in America, putting a quota system into place, which favored immigrants from Northern Europe and Western Europe, but put lower quotas on people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. There's a bit of a class system there. You go back to the late 1800s, at a time when the United States had on the books an actual law excluding people from China, saying no one from China is allowed to enter the United States. You go to more recent times of periods where we've limited employment visas or pulled back kind of seasonal visas that allow workers from Mexico and other places that we depend on coming in because of economic contraction here. We have been through cycles of this over and over and over again. And this, I think, is one of those cycles where the conversation around what does it mean to be an American and who gets to be an American is very much alive and is very much white hot, to go back to that phrase that administration official used to describe how the administration was focusing on immigration. It is a white hot debate. People feel very strongly about it because for some people, they feel their livelihoods are at stake. They feel their identity is at stake. And for other people, in many cases, they feel their actual lives are at stake. We're in one of those periods right now. So I don't know that I would say that most people have lost sight of that. I think it's just a time of turmoil and conversation. And I'll also say, based on our history, that we have always returned to the idea that we are a nation of immigrants.
Thank you. We appreciate that comment. I don't know if you know, but the audience has been voting on these questions. So I'm going to go down the list for as many as we have time to cover. The first one is, what do you think lies ahead for the many undocumented persons in the U.S. with regard to citizenship?
It's a really interesting question. It totally depends on who wins in November. For those of you who've been following the legal battles over the protections for those we call dreamers, right, under the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, you saw that the Supreme Court finally did recently decide that the Trump administration could not unilaterally end that program. But they didn't say that you can't end the program because the program must stay. They said you can't end the program because the way you went about trying to end the program was not the way you could end it. So it kicked it back down. We could see another effort by the administration to try to end those protections for those, several 100,000. I think it's now around 800,000 or so people who could be affected. The Democratic candidates, and I remember asking all of them at the debate back last year, which feels like a lifetime ago, all have plans on the books and in their policy proposals to offer some kind of protection, not only for dreamers, but also for the 10 or 11 million undocumented people currently in the United States. There's no such plan from Republicans. So while there is bipartisan support when you look specifically at a population like the Dreamers, and that's very high across both Democrats and Republicans, it's strikingly one of those issues that people don't disagree about. When it comes to the larger, broader undocumented population, that partisan divide I mentioned earlier really does persist. So if or if not those members of the population have a path to some kind of citizenship, wholly depends on who wins in November.
Thanks. Next question is, of the varying immigration policies tried by the United States, which do you think has worked the best?
I guess that depends on what you think is good. I mean, I'm not quite sure of the question, I guess. Is it what's worked the best to limit migration? What's worked the best to facilitate migration? I think depending on the needs and the shape and the policies and the culture of the moment in this country, all of those things are defined differently through our history. I will say when they've looked at populations where immigrant populations have settled largely, especially in areas that have been devastated after like the 2008 recession, after that housing crisis as well, immigrant populations have tend to acted more sort of like an economic engine in those areas. And when you look at case studies from places like Michigan and California and Texas, that has been a driving force that a lot of local leaders and state leaders will look to as a good thing, as a positive sign. We are heading now into another very troubling economic recession. And so I think that we could see the same kind of similar dependence on some of these communities to try to restart those engines once we're in a position to restart them. But again, that depends largely on who is in the White House in January of next year, because I think all of these policies that we saw from the Trump administration to severely limit migration, both illegal and legal, we can expect to continue. So that will have a huge impact on how that community not only contracts and who's allowed in, but also how some of those economic drivers on the ground play out or not.
Mm-hmm. So many questions that really can't be answered at this point. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
The next question here is, how do our immigration laws and standards compare to other Western countries in Europe and Asia as well? And there are a few Western standard countries there too.
Yes, so the United States definitely has what could be considered some of the most welcoming and permissive immigration standards when you compare them solely to maybe other Western developed nations. It's largely a function of where we are too. We don't have multiple borders with lots of other countries where people are seeking to immigrate easily. So emigrating here requires a lot of effort and a lot of vetting and a great determination, and it tends to attract a certain kind of person as well. But it's important to remember that the U.S. has easily by volume the largest number of immigrants currently living here. And I think every single country is represented. No other country can say that. And that is something that's historically been looked at as a strength, because when it is so difficult to arrive in this country, and when you do tend to attract a certain kind of person who's willing to go through that process and is passing all the vetting standards to get through that process, you tend to attract people who want to build new businesses, who want to study different things, who want to make contributions and live up to the American dream ideal that we've presented to the rest of the world. So it's a very specific kind of population, but it is also the most diverse and the largest immigrant population.
You had talked about the delay in naturalization ceremonies and in processing of visas. Do you think the cancellations relate to COVID, or do you think they are actually political?
Well, it was actually made clear by the head of USCIS, the legal immigration agency that handles all of those processes, that they were stopped during the pandemic because of the global health concern. What's been interesting to watch is that, that agency functions off of its fees. Basically, the volume of applications that it processes and the number of people that it is considering for admittance to the United States is what continues to fund them and keep them alive. And very recently now, the agency is facing a massive budget crunch because they're not processing any applications and they're not accepting any fees, and everything has basically come to a standstill, to the point where they have to consider one of the largest furloughs of their staff in modern American history. And that's very problematic, not only for the people who work there, but also for the many hundreds of thousands of applications that are in process in some form. There was some recent reporting about people who were just weeks away from finalizing their stages of citizenship here in the United States. And now there is just a great deal of uncertainty ahead, which is certainly something we can all relate to, I think, during the pandemic. When it relates to your legal status in the United States, it's probably a little bit different.
May take a long time to ramp it back up again, too, once all these cuts have been made. Next question is, what specific changes would you recommend to better protect immigrants who are in custody from COVID-19? Oh,
that probably requires a level of health expertise that I don't have. I will say that the people I've talked to who've studied not only folks in immigrant detention, I should say, but also people in our federal prison system worry about very basic things, like the inability of anyone to socially distance in these facilities, the inability of people to regularly hand wash in these facilities, and also just sort of a lower standard for the level of care. That's just a fact when it comes to any kind of federal detention in the United States, unfortunately. So goes back to the earlier point I was making. A lot of the concerns around continuing to carry out enforcement when it comes to someone overstaying a visa, for example, a lot of health experts, and not just immigration advocates, a lot of health experts were saying there's no reason to be adding to the detention population at a time like this. And in fact, in other countries, what you saw was them actually relieving their immigrant detention population. In the UK and in France, hundreds of people who were in immigrant detention were tested and put on some kind of monitoring system under home release or sponsored release in some way, because they said, we don't want you staying in close quarters in these places where we can't guarantee your health safety. Those places, we should also point out, actually detain far fewer people en masse than we do here in the United States. It's easier to release 400 or 500 people than it is 30,000. But that is why it remained a huge problem and a concern here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Next question is, biotech firms rely heavily on non-citizen PhDs. Are they being particularly hard hit by recent immigration rules?
Yes, they're twofold, really, I think. What was really interesting for me to see, as someone who's watched and covered this president, was the most recent executive order that he signed, putting a pause on all those employment visas. Those were employment visas that related to very highly skilled workers, right? These are people who work in the tech industry, who work as engineers, as in IT. And that executive order was pushed through despite the protests of the business community here in the United States, because that business community and those leaders know they rely on those workers. They rely on those people coming over to fill those staff positions that they haven't been able to fill from native-born Americans. And so that was an interesting one for me to see more recently, because I think it showed us, when it comes down to either meeting the needs of the business community at this time, which we know the president has felt pressure from before and has ceded to before, on this one issue, that one input did not even matter.
Yeah. Next question. This questioner asks you for your leadership, which is a nice thing to say. And then the question is, how will DACA ever be passed or approved? And what in Congress is holding this no-brainer from being passed?
Oh man, if I had the answer to that, I would, I don't know what I would do. I'd not run for office for sure, but I think it is one of the great modern political mysteries that DACA is sort of an example. It is illustrative of the gridlock at this moment, right? That this is an issue, as I mentioned before, there is bipartisan support. There is high support in the 80s and 90s percentiles for both Republicans and Democrats that they want these folks to have some kind of legal status here. And what often ends up happening, as does in Washington, is this one issue gets wrapped up with a lot of other issues. And those many other issues, they cannot reach consensus on. So this one issue also ends up kind of getting shoved under the rug. And this was a question I asked the candidates at the debate as well, which was to say, would you pull DACA out and have an up or down vote on this one individual issue? That's not a commitment that a lot of people have been able to make because, for a number of reasons we don't have time to get into right now. Suffice to say, if this one issue was just put for an individual up or down vote, it would pass in a heartbeat. But I think we can all agree that those hundreds of thousands of people, residents who've been here, have kind of been caught as political footballs in the middle of a lot of other machinations. And that is both unfortunate and I think frustrating for a lot of people.
Yeah. Next question is, compared to other problems facing America, how would you rank illegal immigration?
I'm not sure that I could rank it, to be honest. I think if, you look at where voters are and, what I think or believe doesn't really matter. It's my job to kind of figure out where people's concerns are and follow those and report on those. If you look at where people's concerns are, often illegal immigration gets tied to national security, as we saw with the campaign ad from 2016 from the Trump campaign. And when you really dig into it, there isn't much of a national security threat coming across our southern border. I mean, any kind of international threat that's arrived in modern history in America has arrived through an airport, arriving here on a plane. And so, I think if you're thinking about how people are ranking their issues in terms of what matters to them, often what you find is an issue like immigration tends to be more of an identity issue. Very few people are directly impacted. Those who live along the border, those who live further along, those who live in communities that have high concentrations of immigrant populations. Immigration often gets linked to other things, to law and order, to the economy, to employment, to national security. And I think depending on how people feel about those issues, they then make up their mind about how they feel about immigration, which is why you look at the polls today and people say, well, I don't really care much about that, but I do care about all these other issues. And I bet if you asked every single one of those issues, they'd have a very strong opinion on immigration, even if it's not what they think is the animating force for them and how they vote.
Yeah, good point. I've always wondered about the fact that since many illegal immigrants arrive on legitimate visas and just don't leave, why have we never had a system for checking about who goes out of the country as well as who comes in?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the frustrations for internal enforcement of immigration, which is the agency ICE, is that they've never been properly resourced to be able to carry out that kind of tracking. And that has certainly come up as an area which is, if you legally arrive, should we have a system in which people have to check in regularly with authorities, prior to their departure date or during their stay, depending on what it is. I think the sort of the counterbalance to having a system that is so permissive and so welcoming for so many different kinds of immigrants, whether they're arriving on diversity visas or as asylees or on employment visas or to, join their family members, is that you can't have the same system tracking everyone. There's a lot of privacy concerns and civil liberties concerns with how you do that at all. It's a huge question, and it's really been on Congress's shoulders to try to figure out how to do that. And unfortunately, the two sides have really only grown farther and farther apart when it comes to how we should be handling and viewing immigration here.
Yeah. Once again, we're back to the polarization, which affects everything these days. We are probably coming. Yeah, beg pardon.
I said it probably does. Yeah.
Yeah. We're probably coming to the end of our question period. I thought we might round it out on a slightly more personal note and ask you a little bit about what your family's experience was with immigration.
I do get this question a lot. And I recognize it's because Amna Nawaz is not a name you hear a lot in the United States. As you mentioned earlier, my parents are originally from Pakistan. I was born and raised in Virginia, but my father first came to the United States in the early 70s to attend school. And then he left, went back to Pakistan. And we have a bit of a different story than a lot of South Asian families who arrived at that time, because that was a time after the opening up of a lot of immigration and the loosening of quotas and doing away with quotas and the 1965 immigration law change. There was a huge time for a lot of people from Asia and other countries that hadn't typically been allowed into the United States to, it's what they called the brain drain. So a lot of highly educated academics and engineers and other people who suddenly had access to America's institutions were flooding over in droves. My father worked for an international organization, and he came over to work with the IMF eventually, the International Monetary Fund. So we joke that, we could have been born in the United States or we could have been born in Switzerland. He could have been posted a number of different places, but they did choose to make their home here in the United States. And they chose to stay here in the United States. And my sisters and I were all born here in the United States. And we are so incredibly grateful for it, because my parents made a conscious decision that when they had their children, they wanted to raise them in the place that they had come to know and to love, in a place where they saw that all the opportunities that had been afforded to them would be available to their children, regardless of whether they had sons or daughters, which would not have been the case necessarily back in Pakistan. And they made the choice and they raised us here. And here we are today. And as I like to say, we make the choice every day, to stay and to be the best Americans that we can be. So we're grateful to them that they made that choice. And we're grateful still that we're raising our kids here today.
I have read that Amna said before she became a journalist, she considered becoming a lawyer because she loves to argue. I think we're all lucky that she became a journalist instead. Amna, this has been a great talk, and we thank you very much for being here. We're hoping that when the coronavirus finally loosens its grip, we can invite Amna to come to Steamboat Springs to give us a talk there in person. If you haven't been to Steamboat Springs, it's a great vacation spot in the mountains with wonderful scenery, hiking, and skiing. We also have seminars at Steamboat, the Strings Music Festival, and what I think is the world's best library to enhance your visit. In the meantime, we hope you'll join us on the next 3 Mondays for our remaining virtual seminars for this season. Admiral James Stavridis on leadership and geopolitics, Dr. Sandra Postel on our freshwater future, and Dr. Kathleen Jamieson on cyber hacking and the 2020 election. So until we meet again, stay safe. We're glad you were with us this evening.